Hey everyone, welcome back to our CISSP study group. I'm B-Dubs. Seriously, it's awesome to see so many of you here. Whether you're looking to take the CISSP exam soon, or just looking to level up your knowledge, thank you all for being here. In our last session, we continued Domain 1 with objectives 1.3 and 1.4. If you missed any sessions throughout this study, you can visit the playlist I created to catch up anytime. I'm dropping the link for that in chat now. After this YouTube presentation, we'll all meet in the Study GRC Discord voice channel for further discussion and Q&A. This is the after party, where we have tons of resources and knowledge drop. If you missed the last one, join us after this session today. Today we're going to keep it rolling with our next two objectives. 1.5, understand requirements for investigation types, and 1.6, develop, document, and implement security policy, standards, procedures, and guidelines. This isn't just about passing a test. It's about understanding how security actually works in the real world. We'll break down these topics into clear, understandable concepts and have some fun together. All right, let's dive right into exam objective 1.5. So picture this: breach alert, policy meltdown, whatever. First things first, we got to figure out what the heck happened, right? But how do you dig into it? How do you investigate? It's totally going to depend on what went down and who's mixed up in it. Different investigation types, like administrative, criminal, civil, regulatory, and industry standards, all require specific approaches to evidence handling and objectives. Simple as that. Think of it like car trouble. You have a flat tire? It's a totally different process than, say, your car getting stolen, right? It's the same way in security. Let's tear down these investigation types, one at a time. Let's start with the big one that screams the headlines: criminal investigations. This is where we're talking serious business, actual crimes, laws getting broken, hacking, data heists, straight up fraud. You know the drill. Criminal investigations deal with the actual crimes and often have accompanying legal punishment. Yeah, no sugarcoating here. If you break the law, you face the consequences. Criminal investigations are primarily led by law enforcement. This could be your local police, state troopers, the FBI, Secret Service. It all depends on the level of chaos. Now, the organization or the security team, we might start these investigations internally, but once we see those red flags, suspecting any criminal activity, we run straight to the law enforcement. Seriously, we're not detectives, and legally we should never be playing like we are law enforcement. The evidence for these criminal cases, it has to be courtroom ready. It must be able to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that the crime occurred. So how do we handle this evidence? We have to be insanely strict here, and chain of custody is king. Think about every police show you've ever seen, but digital. This is CSI Cyber Edition. You have to secure the systems immediately and call the authorities. After that, every log file, every drive, it has to be sealed, signed, and timestamped. Courtroom level stuff from day one. The consequences here are heavy. Convictions could potentially lead to jail or prison time, plus a criminal record that follows you around. And the punishment can be brutal, depending on the crime, the scale, and the impact. For example, if a hacker or outside threat actor busts into your company, steals a juicy database of customer credit card information, this is a crime. Law enforcement should be contacted right away to lead the charge, perform digital forensics, conduct interviews, and build a case to put that hacker away. The bottom line when it comes to criminal investigations is that the authorities here are in charge. We're dealing with crimes. Evidence rules are stricter than your grandma's, and serious consequences for the bad guys. All right, let's move on to the next type of investigation: civil investigations. Now, this is a whole different ballgame from criminal. Think disagreements. Civil investigations deal with disputes between individuals or organizations. The key here is that it's generally not about breaking a specific criminal law in the way we just discussed, but more about disagreements, breaches of contract, and harm done where one party feels wronged by another. These investigations are driven by the organizations or individuals and their attorneys. This is another major difference from criminal cases. Unlike criminal investigations, which are led by law enforcement, these civil investigations are typically driven by the parties involved in the dispute and their attorneys who represent them. It might be company versus company, or person versus company, or individual against individual. Once lawyers get involved, you know you're in civil territory. Think lawsuits here. As far as the evidence goes, the burden of proof in a civil case is actually lower than in criminal cases. It's called preponderance of evidence, meaning it just has to be more likely than not. Think of those old-fashioned scales of justice. If the scale tips just slightly to one side, that side wins. It's a less strict set of evidence rules than we saw with beyond a reasonable doubt in criminal cases. And the outcome is different too. Whichever party is found to be in the wrong or guilty in a civil case usually pays a fine or some other kind of monetary penalty, as well as the related court costs. So it's primarily about financial compensation, making the wronged party feel whole financially, not just about putting someone in jail. If we think about an example, imagine a company, Company A. They strongly believe that a former high-level employee, when they left to go work for a direct competitor, Company B, stole a bunch of really valuable trade secrets. Company A might decide to launch a civil lawsuit against both the former employee and Company B. That would kick off a civil investigation. Both Company A and Company B, along with their teams of lawyers, will be digging for evidence to prove their side of the story, trying to show who is in the wrong and ultimately seeking financial damages in court. Suddenly, it isn't the IT guys digging in logs. It's lawyers filing motions, demanding discovery. It's a totally different vibe here from a criminal investigation. The bottom line in civil investigations is that these are disputes. Lawyers are involved, and evidence rules are a bit more chill. Then there are the financial penalties if you lose. Okay, a different flavor now. Regulatory investigations. Government agencies are in the house, but not exactly for straight-up crime, at least not directly anyway. Regulatory investigations deal with violations of regulated activities. Think super controlled industries like finance, healthcare, power companies, telecommunication companies, heavily regulated zones with tons of rules to follow. And guess who's driving? The regulatory body, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC for finance, HIPAA for healthcare, Federal Communication Commission, or FCC for telecom. You name it. These are the agencies with serious muscle, the power to investigate and actually enforce their rules. The focus here for regulatory investigations is all about compliance. Are these companies playing by their rules and regulations? Yes or no? If no, the consequences are coming. For example, a healthcare company drops the ball, leading to a massive data breach. Patient records are all over the place. The HIPAA alarm bells start ringing. The Department of Health and Human Services, or the HIPAA police, will launch a regulatory investigation. Did they break HIPAA rules that exist to protect patient data? That's the big question here. The punishment involves fines, sanctions, or the organization will have to revamp security big time. And that business reputation, it could be toast. The bottom line with regulatory investigations is that these are the rule breakers and government agencies are taking charge. Compliance is the game and there are penalties for messing up. Then we have administrative investigations. This one hits super close to home for most organizations. This is probably the most common type. Administrative investigations focus on internal violations of organizational policies and incidents identified by an organization. Internal rule breaking, employees going rogue, stuff that isn't necessarily police and lawyers level yet. These investigations are opened, run, and closed by the organization, and they drive the whole show. This is internal affairs basically, and it stays in-house unless, it goes criminal. Then the authorities are contacted and the entire investigation goes to criminal. These investigations apply to those employees goofing off or browsing stuff they shouldn't on company time and breaking maybe an acceptable use policy. Employees breaking internal procedures for sensitive data like an online data leak, not necessarily criminal theft, but policy violation for sure. If a hacker steals credit cards, it could morph into criminal, but it might start as administrative to see what internal policies weren't followed. The purpose here is internal action, and the goal is internal fixes to hopefully prevent it from happening again, or at least make it less likely to happen. This includes disciplining employees, patching policy gaps, beefing up security, and learning from mistakes. For example, imagine an employee was caught red-handed snooping in files they have no business looking at, straight up violating the access policy. HR and the security team gets involved, and it's administrative investigation launch time. They figure out the why, what happened, and what's the fix. The outcome might be training, a slap on the wrist, or maybe even firing. It really depends on the damage. The bottom line with administrative investigations is that this is internal policy chaos, where the organization is in command. Internal fixes and improvements are the mission to strengthen security and lessen the likelihood for it to happen again. And last, but definitely not least, let's talk about industry standards investigations. This one's all about checking if organizations are playing by industry set rules. Industry standards investigations focus on compliance with voluntary but widely accepted industry practices and standards. Think PCI DSS for payment cards, ISO standards, NIST frameworks, the stuff industry groups came up with to set the bar. These investigations are typically initiated by industry organizations, auditors, or the organizations themselves as part of certification or the compliance processes. Sometimes customers or business partners might request them too. The goal here is to make sure you're meeting those industry benchmarks. It's not about laws, that's regulatory. This is about industry best practices and standards that organizations voluntarily adopt to stay competitive and trustworthy. For example, a company wants that sweet PCI DSS certification. They bring in a qualified security assessor, or QSA, to investigate their payment card handling. Are they meeting all those detailed requirements? Every single control? That's an industry standards investigation right there. The consequences of failing these investigations is that the organization could lose industry certifications, or their industry standing takes a hit. They might even lose business partnerships due to reputational damage. And in some cases, failing industry standards could trigger regulatory investigations if certain laws aren't being followed. And nobody wants that. The bottom line with industry standards investigations is that these are about meeting voluntary but crucial industry benchmarks, usually for certification or compliance, and staying competitive in your space. All right, we just went deep into 5 investigation types. Let's do a lightning fast recap to keep them from blurring together. This table is a side-by-side comparison. See how each one's got its own vibe, its own driver, its own game plan, its own end game. So what's the crucial takeaway for us as security professionals? Know these differences. When an incident hits, we have to react fast. We need to know what kind of investigation we are looking at. Who needs to be in the room? Police, lawyers, regulators. Especially that hand it to law enforcement point for criminal stuff. This is non-negotiable. Now, let's switch gears and talk about something equally vital to these investigations: security policy, and all the supporting documentation like standards, procedures, and guidelines. So this is Objective 1.6, develop, document, and implement security policy standards, procedures, and guidelines. This is blueprint time, building the framework for security brick by brick inside any organization. Think about construction, a house, skyscraper, the shed in your backyard. It doesn't matter. Just wanting a solid building isn't going to cut it, right? We need blueprints, policies, material lists, standards, step-by-step manuals, procedures, and some best practice tips tossed in, the guidelines. You got to have the documentation to build it right and build it strong. Policies are simply corporate laws. They're the bedrock of your security universe. And everything else, all those standards, procedures, baselines, and guidelines, they all flow directly from and are designed to support those high-level policies. And to really make this top-down approach work, remember that a security governance committee reporting directly to the board or CEO is key for designing and overseeing these policies. So let's unpack this documentation hierarchy. We call it a hierarchy specifically because it's layered with a top-down flow. Broad strokes at the top and getting more granular as we go down. At the top of the pyramid peak, we have our policies. These are the high-level must-do goals set by the senior management. These should support the organization's vision, the what, and the why of all of it. Below the policies are the standards. These are more specific, but still must-do requirements. Think about what specifically. Standards get technical and solution-focused. Then comes the procedures, super granular, step-by-step instructions, the how-to guides essentially, telling employees exactly how to follow those standards and how to follow those policies. Next up are the baselines. These are the minimum implementation levels for security configurations. Think bare minimum security for your systems. How little can we get away with? Just kidding, mostly. But this is the minimum acceptable level. And finally, at the base of the pyramid are the guidelines, the widest level, flexible, recommended best practices. These are the should-dos, but they're only suggestions and not the law, but more of a do this if you can. Think broad mandates, your policies, to action recipes, the procedures, to friendly advice, guidelines. Now let's zoom in on policies. These are the corporate laws. Remember that. Policies spell out what management wants to achieve with security, period. Management's intentions are in black and white. The overarching security policy must come from the top, the CEO or board of directors ideally. If leadership isn't serious about security, the program is just going to limp along. Policy needs to be shouted from the rooftops, consistently, and lived by senior management. Policies power up the security team. They give us the green light, the mandate to do security, to protect. Policies also map out the security team's turf, their functions, their scope. What are we protecting? What do we actually do? Boundaries and responsibilities. Policies draw these lines. And policies aren't just suggestions, they're the corporate law. They must be created by management, stamped with approval, and then blasted across the organization. The CEO must clearly communicate these and remind the entire organization on a regular basis to create a culture and tone that security needs to be an enabler to the organization. It also ensures that everyone understands the importance of security and that security is everyone's responsibility. Think of it this way. We want security to be seen as an enabler, a partner that helps the business achieve its goals. Not the old school view of security just as an obstacle, always saying no to new ideas. Security should be there to support these new ideas and assist them in making them happen securely. Let's think about a simple policy example. An organization committed to locking down the CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all company data. A high-level policy is gold here. The policy is broad and sets the security compass direction. And remember the accountability versus responsibility that we discussed before? CEO and upper management are accountable for security. Everyone else in the organization is responsible for security. Accountability is at the top of the pyramid, but responsibility? Everyone's got skin in the game. Security is a team sport. The bottom line is that policies are a top-down direction, management's security vision, corporate law, the tone setter for security culture, and helping security become an enabler. And down the pyramid we go, standards are next. Think the specifics. Specific hardware and software solutions. Standards are all about specific technology, specific tools, specific mechanisms, specific products, telling you exactly what to deploy to hit those policy goals. Standards are mandatory requirements. No maybes, no options. Use this solution. End of story. Let's think about some examples of standards out in the wild. Specific antivirus software. The standard might say company laptops must run vendor X antivirus. Done deal. Specific access control system. It might be server rooms, physical security. They have to be vendor Y access control with biometric fingerprint readers for entry. Period. A specific firewall system. The perimeter firewall, it has to be from vendor Z, next-gen firewall, configured exactly to the security team's standard configuration documentation. And password complexity standards. Password rules. These are your length minimums, character type rules, password history blacklist. These are all standards in action. The bottom line here is that standards provide details for the specific technology and tools, mandatory choices, concrete policy implementations. Now let's jump into procedures. These are the how-tos, the nuts and bolts, the seriously fine print. Procedures are the detailed, painstakingly detailed, step-by-step instructions on how to perform a specific security task. There's zero room for improv, zero guesswork. They take you from start to finish in the task. Just like policies and standards, procedures are completely mandatory. Follow these steps exactly. No skipping steps and no creative interpretation. Let's think about some procedure examples. If you have a new employee, it's time for a procedure. Account creation steps, access right assignments, security badge issuance, security training, all laid out step by step with no details spared. An incident goes off, procedures are your lifeline. Step-by-step actions from the initial alert to full-blown containment, eradication, and recovery. Who to call, what to do first, what to do next. Are you hiring security vendors? Procedure manual time, vendor selection steps, due diligence checklist, contract review process. Security clauses are mandatory. Approval workflows. Another important example is how to securely dispose of old and obsolete IT equipment like old hard drives or even paper documents to absolutely prevent any potential data leaks. A procedure would detail the approved and mandatory steps to take for secure disposal. Maybe physical destruction, maybe degaussing, maybe secure shredding, whatever the approved method is. The bottom line for procedures is that they are step-by-step deep dives, mandatory moves, and the recipe book for security tasks. And now we move down to baselines. Think of baselines as the security floor, the absolute minimum security the organization will accept. Baselines are focused on clearly defining the absolute minimum acceptable configuration for different security mechanisms and products that the organization uses. It's really setting the least we can do and still be considered reasonably secure. Anything below a defined baseline is simply not acceptable. Baselines really set the absolute floor for essential security configurations for all types of systems and technologies. They are the lowest acceptable level of the security posture. So let's think about some examples. You might have configurations for your IDS or intrusion detection systems. For an organization's IDS, a baseline might very specifically define the minimum rule set that must be enabled in the IDS, the minimum logging levels that must be in place, the minimum alert thresholds that must be configured to trigger alerts, and so on. It's the minimum acceptable level of configuration for the IDS to be considered effective. And then configurations for access control systems. Think about physical access control. A baseline might dictate that the minimum required door sensor sensitivity on physical access control systems, or the minimum acceptable alarm response times if an intrusion attempt is detected, the minimum backup power requirements for the system to function during power outages. And a really common use of baselines is in system hardening. You might have heard of the CIS benchmarks or DISA STIGs. Those are both examples of well-known and widely used sets of security configuration baselines. These are the predefined sets of recommended security settings and configurations that you can use to harden operating systems, applications, and network devices to a minimum acceptable security level. The bottom line for baselines is that they are the minimum acceptable configurations. The security floor, we're making sure we're at least meeting a minimum bar. And finally, our last stop for documentation is guidelines. These are the nice-to-haves and best practices. Think helpful advice and not hard rules. Guidelines are recommendations, suggestions, friendly advice, not mandatory orders. This goes into the good idea pile, not the must-do pile. Guidelines are incredibly flexible. Organizations should aim to follow them. They're good for you security-wise, but they're not required and are not enforced like policies, standards, procedures, and baselines. They have flexibility built right in. The major point here for the CISSP is that guidelines are not mandatory. If you break a guideline, you're not going to have any negative findings during an audit. This is a big difference from policies, standards, procedures, and baselines. Now let's think about some guideline examples. We have government recommendations, like NIST guidelines. CISA best practices are often used within guideline territory. This is good advice from the government, but they're not legally mandated most of the time. Security configuration recommendations, your vendor best practice documentation, industry security advice. These are all guidelines. A vendor saying, hey, heads up, try this. That's a guideline. Organizational guidelines. These are your internal tips and tricks, documentation on passwords, social media. All of these are guidelines if they're just friendly advice and not enforced policy. Maybe a multi-factor authentication guideline. A guideline might suggest multi-factor authentication, or MFA, for all accounts for a security boost. It's highly recommended, but it might not mandate it across the board policy style. Remember, guideline, not policy. And the bottom line here is that guidelines are simple recommendations. Best practices, flexible suggestions, they're not mandatory and are audit-proof, mostly. Okay, documentation is written, our pyramid is built, but just having these isn't the finish line, right? We've got to develop, thoroughly document, and then effectively implement them. It's implementation time. Let's take a look at the development process. We have to first align with the business strategy. Security documentation has to be locked in with those business goals, aligned with the business strategy. Security has to be business-driven security and not just for the sake of being secure. We also perform risk assessments to drive this documentation, address the real threats and the real risks to the organization. Next, we need to define the roles and responsibilities. Who owns each document? Who updates them? Who does the enforcing? Specific roles and responsibilities, and then the enforcement. We need to clearly document everything. And then we have top-down security governance. Best practice is to have a security governance committee that reports back to the board and CEO. This committee designs the policies and shapes the security framework. Top-down approach, remember the tone from the top. This committee can make it happen. And don't forget these documents aren't set in stone. Policies might be reviewed less often, but standards, procedures, baselines, and guidelines, they all need to be living documents, updated frequently to keep pace with technology and the changing threat landscape. Make sure your process includes regular reviews and updates, assigning responsibility for keeping them current. So let's think about an anti-malware software policy example to tie it all together. The policy is that the organization mandates anti-malware to protect against malicious software. This is a high-level policy that the Security Governance Committee puts together. And then the standard, if it's a Windows workstation, they must all have Vendor X anti-malware. This sets the specific standard for all your Windows workstations across the organization to satisfy that high-level policy. And then the procedure. This is your anti-malware install procedure. The IT help desk has to follow this procedure. It's a step-by-step guide to install the Vendor X anti-malware solution on all Windows workstations. The baseline here is that vendor X anti-malware must be configured with real-time scanning enabled, definitions updated daily, and the full system scans scheduled weekly. This defines the minimum acceptable security configuration for the anti-malware solution. Then the guideline, it's a good idea to have heuristic scanning, which is behavior-based or advanced malware detection that can identify malicious activity based on patterns. If possible, try to implement this. This guideline is just a suggestion and not mandatory. So why even bother with all of this documentation? What are the benefits here? We have consistent security practices. Everyone is on the same page, playing by the same rules, using the same playbook. Consistency is a security win. Enforceable security requirements. Policies are enforceable through standards, procedures, and baselines. This documentation creates measurable, auditable security. It's aligned with the business goals. Security documentation is linked to the business strategy. It's risk-driven. Security supporting the business, not fighting it. Then we have some pitfalls to avoid. Leadership support failure. If leadership shrugs off security, the policy effort crashes and burns. The tone from the top, remember? And weak supporting documentation. If your standards, procedures, and guidelines are weak, your policy implementation fails. Supporting documentation has to be solid, practical, and supportive. The bottom line here is that development and implementation has to align with the business, with clearly defined roles and responsibilities. In hierarchy form, dodging the leadership fails. Keep up with that supporting documentation and keep them updated. Implementation is everything. Okay, let's review everything we just covered from Objective 1.6. Remember the hierarchy, and remember this flow. The security documentation structure is all about consistent, clearly defined, and effectively enforceable security practices. It's definitely not just about piles of paperwork for the sake of it. It's really the essential foundation that a robust and effective security program is built. Think of policies as the fundamental laws, standards and baselines as the specific rules of engagement. Procedures are the detailed instruction manuals for how to do things right, and guidelines as helpful best practice advice. Knowing how they all mesh is the CISSP gold. And one last really key point. While companies define these documents slightly different in the real world, remember there are established industry standard definitions for policies, standards, procedures, baselines, and guidelines. Understanding those industry standards, that's going to be your secret weapon to use these documents effectively and consistently, no matter where you work. And that's Objective 1.6. We crushed it, guys. All right, killer session today. Let's do a quick recap of what we covered today. Objective 1.5, understand requirements for investigation types. These are your criminal investigations that are focused on legal violations and criminal prosecution. Civil investigations that are dealing with disputes between parties. Regulatory investigations that are examining compliance with regulations. Administrative investigations, that's your internal organizational matters. And then industry standards are ensuring compliance with established standards like ISO, NIST, or PCI DSS. And then we covered Objective 1.6, develop, document, and implement security policies, standards, procedures, and guidelines. Your security documentation, this is your policies that are high-level security directives. Your standards are specific mandatory requirements. Your procedures are the detailed step-by-step instructions. And baselines are your minimum security requirements. Those guidelines, those are just recommended best practices. These foundational concepts are crucial for understanding how organizations handle investigations and structure their security documentation hierarchy. All right, that wraps up today's topics on exam objectives 1.5 and 1.6. Remember, this is a lot of information, so don't be afraid to rewatch sections, pause, and take notes. These sessions will remain on YouTube, so you can watch anytime. Additionally, I'll be going back to each one after the live streams to add chapters, so you can revisit certain sections. The key here is to understand the concepts, not just memorize the details. Think about how these principles apply in the real-world scenarios. And don't forget that managerial perspective. Now it's time to start the after party. This is where we all move over to the Study GRC Discord server and join the dedicated CISSP voice channel for open discussion and answer any questions you have. I recommend not missing this part. This is where the real collaboration happens. If you're not in the Discord yet, you can go to cissp.britwhite.io for the Discord link. And don't forget to grab your CISSP role when you join, so you can find the dedicated channels. Next time, we'll move on to the next objectives within Domain 1, Security and Risk Management, during our live session on Saturday, March 15th at 3 p.m. Central US Time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in Discord.